The last thing Abigail remembered was sitting in a cab, listening to the voice of the man she thought she loved. Then darkness. When she woke up, her hands were tied, her head pounding. In the distance she heard laughter, men speaking in hushed tones. And then, the words that sent ice through her veins. The doctor will be here soon. Before we get into this chilling true crime story, make sure you subscribe to Just Dark Crimes and turn on notifications. We bring you the darkest and most shocking crime stories that you won't believe are real. Now let's get into it. Abigail never thought she would be the victim of an international scam. She was careful, intelligent, and thought she knew the man she had been talking to for months. His name was Daniel, or so he claimed. He was charming, successful, and planning a future with her, or at least that's what he made her believe. What started as an online romance quickly became something deeper. So deep that Abigail made a bold decision, to surprise him in South Africa for Valentine's Day. But when she arrived, her dream of love turned into a nightmare she barely escaped. Abigail had always been cautious with online dating. But Daniel seemed different. He was kind, attentive, and had a way with words that made her feel special. They met on Facebook, where he presented himself as a successful businessman living in South Africa. He often spoke about his lavish lifestyle, dinners at expensive restaurants, business meetings, and his plans to visit the US soon to be with her. Their relationship grew quickly. They talked every day, shared their dreams, and even discussed marriage. Every time she had doubts, he reassured her with sweet messages, romantic voice notes, and video calls, though he never showed too much of his surroundings. As Valentine's Day approached, Abigail was determined to make it unforgettable. The two of them had joked about how she would surprise him, but he always insisted it would be better if he came to her, claiming it wasn't safe for her to travel. But Abigail, caught up in the excitement of the moment, decided to take matters into her own hands. She booked a flight, packed her bags, and flew to South Africa, certain he would be thrilled. When she landed in Johannesburg, she called him, eager to share the news. "Hey, it's Abigail. Guess what? I'm at the airport." Daniel answered, and she could hear the briefest hesitation in his voice before he said, "Oh, I'll come pick you up." Then just as quickly he hung up. Abigail waited, her anticipation growing with every passing minute. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that Daniel wasn't as excited as she thought he would be. She waited and waited, wondering if he'd show up or if, as he expected, she'd get tired and turn back. Abigail waited at the airport, growing increasingly anxious as hours passed with no word from Daniel. She tried calling him again, but the phone went straight to voicemail. He had promised to pick her up. He had promised they'd spend Valentine's Day together. But all of that was slipping away as each unanswered call echoed in her mind. Determined not to let the situation spiral, Abigail used the clues he had mentioned in their past conversations to track his location. She plugged in the address he had casually mentioned and, despite the pit in her stomach, took a taxi. The driver navigated through a city she didn't recognize, weaving through crowded streets, leaving the city's bustling life behind. Soon, the concrete gave way to broken-down buildings, unkempt roads, and people staring at her as she passed. What was supposed to be a luxury getaway was quickly unraveling. Instead of a gated mansion or a chic apartment, she found herself in a rundown slum. The vibrant life she imagined her love would offer her was nowhere to be found. The reality hit her like a brick wall. When she arrived at the address, she hesitated for a moment, looking around. This wasn't what she had imagined. Daniel wasn't the man he had presented himself to be. But she pushed the thought aside, hoping that there had been some mistake. Maybe there was a good explanation. She knocked on the door, and after what felt like an eternity, Daniel appeared. His eyes widened when he saw her, but there was something off about his reaction. Nervousness in his eyes, a forced smile on his face. "Abigail," he said, his voice low. "You shouldn't have come. This isn't what I expected." Her heart sank. He seemed more like a stranger than the man she'd fallen in love with online. Abigail's mind raced. Daniel's reaction didn't make sense. The man she'd been talking to for months, the man she trusted, was now standing in front of her, acting like he barely recognized her. The excitement she'd felt only hours before had vanished, replaced by a creeping sense of dread. Something wasn't right. The joyful anticipation of surprising him had now morphed into confusion and suspicion. She tried to read his face, searching for any hint of sincerity, but there was nothing. His smile seemed forced, and his eyes, those eyes that had always made her feel safe, were now cold and unreadable. Her stomach churned. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly, betraying her unease. "Why didn't you tell me the truth? About who you are, and where we were going?" His gaze darted around as if he were looking for an exit, a way out of the conversation. He shifted on his feet uncomfortably. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he sighed, almost imperceptibly, and gave her that same tight smile. But it didn't reach his eyes. It was as if she was staring at a mask, something far darker beneath the surface. "I'm sorry. I was going to tell you, I swear," he said, his voice low, almost apologetic, but his words didn't match the look in his eyes. "But I didn't expect you to show up like this. I thought we'd have time to talk first. Time to prepare." Abigail's heart thudded loudly in her chest. She tried to keep calm, but her instincts screamed at her that something was terribly wrong. She swallowed the lump in her throat and tried to stay composed. "I just wanted to see you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wanted us to finally be together." A chill ran down her spine as she noticed how he was looking at her now, distant, almost calculating. Then without warning, Daniel stepped closer. Too close. His presence loomed over her, and his next words felt like a command. "I think you need to relax," he said, his voice unnervingly calm, too controlled. "Come with me. I'll explain everything. I promise." Every fiber of Abigail's being screamed to walk away, but she didn't know how to back out now. She had traveled across the world for this moment. She had trusted him, believed in him. So, with hesitation weighing on her shoulders, she allowed him to lead her toward a cab waiting just outside. The driver didn't look at her, his face impassive, his eyes trained on the road. Daniel climbed in beside her, his demeanor unchanged. As they drove through the dimly lit streets of Johannesburg, Daniel continued to talk, his words flowing smoothly, almost too smoothly. "It's going to be okay. You'll understand once we're there. I didn't mean for it to be this way. Just trust me. We'll talk and everything will make sense. Here, have some water, you must be tasty," he said. But Abigail wasn't listening. The unease in her gut was growing, and despite his reassurances, her mind kept spiraling. Why had he been so distant earlier? Why was he acting like this now? None of it added up. And as the car weaved through the quiet streets, she felt her body beginning to betray her. A sudden wave of dizziness washed over her, and her vision blurred at the edges. The world around her started to spin, and she gripped the seat, trying to steady herself. "Daniel?" she whispered, her voice slurring. "What's happening?" He didn't respond right away. For a moment she caught a glance between him and driver through the rearview mirror, like they knew each other. Daniel said, "Just relax. We're almost there." The last thing Abigail remembered was the fading sound of the cab's engine and the low hum of the streets outside. Her mind felt like it was slipping into a fog, and no matter how hard she tried to stay conscious, everything went black. When Abigail's eyes finally fluttered open, everything felt wrong. Her head throbbed, and the familiar hum of the city had been replaced by an eerie silence. The air smelled damp, musty, and stale. She tried to move, but her arms were restrained, bound tightly at her sides. Panic surged through her chest. She struggled against the ropes, but the more she fought, the more they dug into her skin. "Hello?" she croaked, her voice raspy from the sedative, but the only answer was the faint sound of men talking in the distance. She froze, straining to hear their words. They were laughing, casual even, as if they weren't discussing a life-or-death situation. Her pulse quickened as one voice became clearer. "You think the doc will show up soon?" a man asked. The voice was deep, rough. Another voice responded, equally unfazed. "He'll be here. Just wait for him. We can't do this without him." Abigail's heart skipped a beat. "Doc, what were they talking about?" As the conversation continued, she realized with horror that they weren't discussing a ransom or a kidnapping. They were talking about her. "Is she awake?" one of the men asked. Abigail stiffened, holding her breath, hoping they didn't notice her. "No. She's still out of it," another voice said. "We'll wait until the doctor arrives. He needs to take care of the rest." "The doctor?" Abigail's blood ran cold. The men weren't planning to kill her quickly, they were waiting for a doctor. She forced herself to calm down, swallowing the rising panic in her chest. She had to think. She had to escape. They continued to talk, unaware that she was listening. The conversation shifted, and Abigail used the moment of distraction to try and loosen the ropes that held her. She tugged at the restraints, her fingers numb from the sedative, but she wasn't about to give up. She could feel the knot starting to loosen bit by bit. And then, finally, one of the ropes gave way. Abigail's heart raced as the ropes loosened, the feeling of freedom inching closer with each pull. The men's voices grew fainter, still unaware of her quiet struggle. Her hands were still unsteady from the sedative, but she refused to stop. The longer she stayed tied up, the more time they had to complete their gruesome plan. With a final tug, the ropes fell away. She could feel the blood rushing back into her limbs as she stood up shakily, trying to control her breathing. The cold ground beneath her feet made her shiver and her body ached, but she knew she couldn't waste time. She crept carefully toward the edge of the small room, her eyes darting around for any escape. The men's laughter continued, a constant reminder that they were waiting for the moment to strike. She peered through a crack in the wall, her heart leaping into her throat when she saw them. 3 men standing by a crude table with medical instruments laid out. It was clear now, this wasn't a kidnapping for money. This was far darker. Abigail forced herself to breathe steadily, thinking fast. She couldn't face them alone, not like this. She had to find help. With as much quiet determination as she could muster, she slipped out of the shack and into the night, moving as swiftly and silently as possible. Her legs were shaky from the drugs, and she stumbled through the dark streets, hoping for any sign of life. The slum was empty, save for the occasional figure lingering in the shadows. She pushed on, refusing to give in to fear. After what felt like an eternity, she saw a figure in the distance, a fisherman hauling nets by the shore. His weathered face looked surprised when she approached, drenched in sweat and covered in dirt. "Please, help me," she gasped, tears streaming down her face. "They're going to kill me." The fisherman didn't hesitate. Without a word, he nodded and led her down a narrow alley to his small boat, hidden away from the eyes of the men. He quickly rowed her to a safer part of the city, where she could find help. Abigail could hardly believe she had escaped, her mind still reeling from the horrors she had narrowly avoided. When the fisherman finally docked at a small, dimly lit harbor, Abigail barely had the strength to climb out of the boat. Her body was battered, bruised, and drained from the terrifying experience, but she didn't stop. Her mind was already racing ahead, replaying everything that had happened. The fisherman helped her to her feet and guided her to the nearest police station. The urgency in her steps was undeniable. She had to make sure they believed her. She had to make them act quickly. The officers at the station were initially skeptical, eyeing her like she might be just another distraught woman with a wild story. But as Abigail recounted what had happened, her voice shaking, her words carried a weight of truth no one could ignore. They were going to harvest my organs," Abigail explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "There was a doctor, they were waiting for him. He was going to help them, take my organs." She could barely get the words out, but she knew it was the only way to make them understand. One officer's face grew pale as he listened. The words organ harvesting were no joke in South Africa, and they were starting to connect the dots. The officer immediately called in a team to search the location where she had been held. But when they arrived, the shack was abandoned. No signs of the men, no trace of the operation they had planned. "Are you sure they were there?" the officer asked, his voice careful. Abigail nodded, but it was clear that they weren't going to find anything. The men had vanished into thin air, and so had their hideout. The police tried to dig into Daniel's past, but every lead they followed turned cold. He had used fake names, fake documents, and had taken every precaution to cover his tracks. The men she had encountered had done the same, leaving no evidence behind. Abigail's heart sank as the officer delivered the news. "I'm sorry, but we can't find them. They used false identities and it looks like they've disappeared." Her whole world seemed to crash down in that moment. The man she thought she knew, the man she had fallen in love with, was a ghost. The truth she had discovered was too horrifying to fathom, and now it seemed like nothing could be done to stop him. She was safe, yes, but the mental scars would stay with her forever. And her heart, broken, betrayed, would never be the same. Abigail returned to the United States a shadow of the woman who had eagerly boarded that flight months earlier. While her physical wounds healed, the psychological scars ran deep, haunting her every step. Each day felt like a battle to overcome the nightmare that had almost claimed her life. The betrayal by Daniel, the man she had trusted completely, gnawed at her. The faces of the men who had plotted her death and the memory of the doctor who never arrived were images she couldn't escape. Though her body was safe, Abigail had lost more than just her faith in love. She had lost her sense of security, her belief in the goodness of people. Every new person she met, every man who smiled at her felt like a potential threat. The world, once full of hope and possibility, now seemed dangerous and unpredictable. Her journey had started with the innocent hope of surprising the man she loved. But it had turned into a life-altering tragedy, one she would carry for the rest of her days. The carefree girl who had boarded that plane was gone, replaced by someone forever changed, someone who now lived with the knowledge of how quickly trust could be shattered. Abigail would never forget that night in the slum. And as she reflected on what she had endured, one quote echoed in her mind: "Trust takes years to build, seconds to break, and forever to repair." Abigail would never be the same, but she was learning to live with the scars, physical and emotional, that would define her life going forward. If you found Abigail's story chilling and heartbreaking, don't forget to subscribe to Just Dark Crimes for more twisted tales from the world of true crime. Like and share to spread awareness and help others understand the dangers behind seemingly innocent relationships. Stay safe and always trust your instincts.